Good evening. Thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Dr. Andrea Douglas, and I'm the Executive Director of the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center. I hope you all have been enjoying your Liberation and Freedom Day, a holiday here in Charlottesville. And this moment, our ability to enjoy this day as a holiday came as a consequence of the Blue Ribbon Commission's recommendations, the replacement of Liberation and Freedom Day, replacing Jefferson's birthday, Thomas Jefferson's birthday, as a city holiday. And so now we have been celebrating for the last 4 or 5 years, I believe it is now, this auspicious moment when 52%, 53% of our community who had been formerly enslaved were freed as a consequence of the March movement of Union soldiers into Charlottesville. I'm joined tonight by my partner in crime. We've been together now for since 2016, 2017, working on public history projects, Dr. Jalane Schmidt. And tonight we're going to talk about that moment of liberation and freedom and how that occurred. It's really important that we understand that as we move forward into the work that we are going to do in the next couple of months, in the next couple of years. So Jalane, thanks so much for joining me for this conversation. I'm looking forward to dialoguing with you about this moment and thinking about what that moment in 1865 represents then and how it is important for us today. So why don't you go ahead and share some thoughts about that with us?
Right, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for having me. Today's been a great day. It started out early in the morning down Court Square at the slave auction sites there with the Reclaimed Roots Descendants Alliance having a vigil there in the morning, and then at midday at the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers at the University of Virginia, an event hosted by the descendants of enslaved communities of UVA. So it's been a day that's had several commemorations, and now we're going to just talk a little bit, reflect a little bit about the historical moment. You know, what was going on there. So I've got some images here, if I can show them, if I can find them. Here we go. Yeah. First of all, and I promise this is the last we'll see of this tonight. We will not speak of it again. But just to say a little bit about why we don't know so much about our history that Dr. Douglas and I are going to be talking about tonight. And it's because, since almost, since shortly after the war, or decades after the war, the kind of public iconography and the sorts of curriculum that was promoted in schools did not emphasize the history of it was literally the majority of the population, in our community. So we want to, kind of look for better sources than monuments. Monuments are this isn't memory, and it's not. It's memory is not the same as history. Let's put it this way. And this is not a good account of history. And instead, what we want to do is we want to look at the accounts of enslaved peoples themselves. And fortunately, we have some sources for that that come in the form of interviews that were conducted with enslaved people, who were, very elderly at the time. This is, kind of in the 20s and 30s and 40s. These series of interviews were conducted. There are quite a number of them in this book that are from people who were enslaved in Charlottesville and Albemarle County. And you've Dr. Douglas, you've got a great account.
Yes.
In the permanent exhibit. I wonder if you can share it with us.
Yeah. And when we're talking about sources, one of the great sources that we use is a WPA project that was done in 1935. And so one of the accounts, and I'm going to read it in a kind of vernacular, it's a comment made by Betty Jones, who was hired out to the Randolphs and during the war. And so she's talking about her grandmother, right? And she's saying this in 1935. And what she says is, Grandma says she was hired out to the Randolphs during the war. One day, while she was weeding corn, another slave, Mammy Tolliver, came up to her and whispered, Sarah, they tell me that Mars Lincoln done set all us slaves free. Grandma say, is that so? And she dropped her hoe and run all the way to the Thacker's place. 7 miles it was. And run to old missus and looked at her real hard. Then she yelled, I's free. Yes, I's free. Ain't gotta work for you no more. You can't put me in your pocket now. Grammy say Miss Thacker started boo-hooing and threw her apron over her face and run in the house. Grandma knew it was true then. And I think that's an amazing account of that. So that was Betty Jones's account of liberation, that liberation experience. And she was talking in the WAPA project in 1935. Mm-hmm. And it's accounts that like that we use to really understand what the enslaved population at that moment that they become formally enslaved people were actually thinking.
Right. Yeah, it's great. Yeah, there's so many good ones in there, and you know, and there's a lot of good work that's being done, and I want to kind of give some credit to our colleagues at the Now Center for Civil War History at the University of Virginia. They've got a great project called Black Virginians in Blue that looks at the records of the 260 odd men, Black men from Albemarle County that served in the United States Colored Troops. But I wanted to talk about like what, you know, at the time of the war itself here in Charlottesville, this really wasn't a theater of the war. There really wasn't fighting going on here. The fighting that was going on was, you know, 50 miles west in the Shenandoah Valley. You know, that was kind of the theater of war. There was a mild skirmish at one point. It doesn't even merit being called a battle, you know, up near Rio Road. But what was the kind of the constant threat, how people experienced the war here was here locally in Albemarle County among enslaved people, was the threat of conscription and of being separated from family yet again by having the menfolk, enslaved men, taken from the homestead and to the front lines where they would do things like dig trenches, as we can see in this period illustration here. So being forced into incombatant roles. And again, we've got some accounts that you know, we're kind of in this phase of needing to kind of learn our history. There's at least one instance where there were 4 enslaved people who were being drafted, and an officer of the Confederate Army had come to collect them, to take them away, and they killed him, you know, to just slash out and kill them. Another account that comes from the Weevils and the Wheat book that we were just looking at is that of William Johnson, who's, again, right here in Albemarle County. He was taken by his master to the front. His master was a soldier. And while he was there, he talked with other enslaved conscripts that were there, other slaves that had also been brought to the front by their masters. And they were tasked with guarding the Union prisoners of war. And the Union soldiers told them when their masters were away that, hey, if you can you see where the fighting is over here, if you can get to Union lines, you're free. You know, so William Johnson said he wasn't really sure prior to going to the front what the war was really about, you know, but like the stakes became very clear to him then, is what he recounted. It was just like, you know, said, now I realize why, what was going on. Anyway, he escapes. He and his friends escape, and he joins the United States Colored Troops. You know, one of many, about 260 men from our area that served in the U.S. Colored Troops. Another such man was James T.S. Taylor from Charlottesville. He was a free Black man from a free Black family. He was literate. His dad was a shoemaker. But he was also feeling the kind of the vice, the conscription calls, kind of get closer and closer. And he didn't want to get conscripted and taken to work in the Confederate army. And so he escaped, and we know this. And how do we know this? This is amazing, because he wrote a letter to Abraham Lincoln. He wrote a letter to his commander in chief while he was in the U.S. colored troops, and described to Abe Lincoln. We don't know if President Lincoln ever read it, but he describes to Lincoln his escape. It's quite an adventure. Somebody needs to write a book about it. I think I will. I think I'll see if we can do that. It's a great adventure book is what it would be. How he escapes, and he's avoiding pickets, the Confederate guards, here's a horse coming down the road, and he like runs off into the bushes, waits for it to go. And then he keeps, amazing stories, a lot of bravery here, and we then, what happens here is that we heard this account from, was her name Betty Jones? Was that her name, Dr. Douglas?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we've, heard some, accounts of what happened with the arrival of troops. And I'm just going to read another one here really quick from the Lynchburg Daily Virginian that said, when Union troops arrived in Albemarle County, quote, "The county has lost many hundred horses and from 1,500 to 2,000 Negroes. Large numbers of Negroes mounted on stolen horses were seen going off with the Yankees. Women with little children in their arms seemed as eager to be off as the men." So we have accounts like that. Also accounts, very unsympathetic accounts, of course, from the UVA faculty about the so-called servants, a euphemism for enslaved person, running off to the enemy, as they described the federal troops. But it wasn't really this clear-cut thing, this was, March, and the war is still going on, and the Union Army wasn't really thrilled to have an extra, 2,000 mouths to feed. This wasn't like, kind of a warm embrace, going on here, even as people are, enslaved people are kind of self-emancipating themselves. And we have different accounts, for instance, from Edgehill, and, that are told by descendants here to this day about how their relatives, their ancestors, took the opportunity to escape, when the Union troops came through. But then there kind of wasn't really always a place to go to. And also they missed their family and were worried about their families, and, would come back and try to care for them. And then this kind of, this lack of certitude and this kind of things kind of being in flux, of course, sometimes the white folks in the record interpreted this as these being faithful slaves or shiftless, this sort of thing. We hear a very different account, coming from the descendants, of what was going on. And what we see is just a lot of turbulence going on, even as the Union Army is coming through.
And can I just add one little thing too, about that one part? When you really start to think about, if you want to contextualize it, if you think about enslavement in all of Virginia in 1860, for instance, right? Virginia as a state is got 31% of the state is enslaved. And in Albemarle County, we're talking about 52% of the area is enslaved. So the notion of people walking off farms, the notion of people joining the Union Army by those people who are benefiting from chattel slavery, you can imagine what that real distress looks like. That it's not just Union soldiers coming in, but the implications of the loss of that kind of money too, I think is a really interesting way of seeing what that larger picture looks like too, as this is all happening.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah. And this is, of course, these are two sides of the coin. I mean, you hear these, laments of loss, from the, the diaries of the UVA professors that, that are complaining, and other, speaking of the Randolph plantation where, Betty Jones, said she was enslaved, we have the accounts there from Jefferson's granddaughter writing about, the arrival of Union soldiers there. So yes, there was this, sense of, tenseness. But from what we hear from Black folks who were enslaved, a kind of a sense of expectation, hope,
Exactly.
This is a chance,
Exactly.
Yeah. And so this is happening in march, and from the accounts that we have, it had been raining and raining, just buckets for days and days and days. The mud was so thick it went up to the hubs of the wagons on the, of the cannons that were being pulled. Horses up to their knees in mud, just really mucky. The rivers had overflown their banks. So it was just, if you imagine that, and then an army kind of, slogging into town, and a couple thousand enslaved folks slogging out after them too. So just the misery, just the physical discomfort, factor too, as you really, think about that, and just the unsureness and expectation. So then a month later, exactly a month later, actually, comes the fall of Richmond. And I mention this here because we again have some wonderful accounts, thanks to our friends at the Now Center for Civil War History at UVA and their Black Virginians in Blue project. We know of some men from Albemarle County that were members of the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry, and they were part of the onslaught of Union forces that liberated Richmond, and we know that there were others that were in those regiments who were originally from Richmond itself, and some of them we have accounts of them going back to their to the homes of their former masters, and kind of almost kind of thumbing their noses at them, and also visiting family, and they are hailed in the streets, so that the Union Army is marching into Richmond. It's been abandoned by the Confederates. It's burning. It's in ashes, and here comes these columns of Union soldiers led by some units of United States colored troops. I mean, if you can just imagine, it was just amazing. The accounts we have from the time, just the amazement of Black Richmond residents watching this march into town. It's just amazing.
Yeah. And I think, as we started out saying, these are the kinds of stories we just don't know anything about. This granular detail that creates a much better nuance of the story.
Right.
And beginning with this idea that Charlottesville was in some ways not a space where the war was fought, but so deeply involved in the movement of people, and then what ultimately happens in Richmond. I think
absolutely. Yeah. And what we did have here in Charlottesville was UVA was effectively turned into a giant army hospital. I mean, there were, wounded men from the front were being brought on railroad cars, to UVA and the General Hospital, and treated there, and sometimes buried there, as happened, So there was a hospital here, and there was at Woolen Mills was where they made Confederate uniforms for the Confederate Army. And there was also a manufacturer of artificial limbs, I'm told. That was, there was a need for that as, people were becoming injured in the war, So there was small, there were these manufacturing, kind of going on, but this was not, a place where armaments were made, or, weren't battles going on and that sort of thing. But yeah. And while these are kind of granular details, I mean, the liberation of Richmond is a really stirring story, and one that, I should say, our colleague, John Edwin Mason, his ancestor was also in the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
Yeah. From here in Virginia. He was from here in Virginia, and he served with the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry. So he was part of this force, this liberating force that marched into Richmond. Just what a wonderful history, right? To have. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And just some other men from our area, from here in Albemarle County and Charlottesville. Three men: John Allen, James Garland, George Lewis. Were also fighting with the U.S. colored troops, and they were in that Battle of Petersburg, right outside of Richmond. That is the battle outside of Richmond. That once Petersburg fell, and that was a major railroad center, then that meant that the capital of the Confederacy. Richmond fell, so they were part of that. So they were, it's kind of ironic because they were also the 19th Virginia Infantry of the Confederate veteran of the Confederate Army was there too. And those were white people from Charlottesville and Albemarle County. So they were likely shooting at one another. It's kind of it's ironic if you think about it, right? That they're on opposite sides of the war. They're both from Albemarle County, but there they are. And then, but did not rest after the Battle of Petersburg. After Richmond fell, on April the 3rd, they marched all the way to Appomattox. And their commanding officer wrote an account after the war that's just really stirring, just about how dedicated they were. They didn't complain. It'd been horrible. They'd come under heavy fire, and they didn't rest, and they just marched on to Appomattox, where they then guarded train and armament supplies, and then Lee surrendered to Grant, and the war was coming to an end then. So we have great people from here.
Right. And that's one of the things I always say, that when you look at this period, Charlottesville is a perfect sort of crucible to look through and understand what this early history is. When we delve into Charlottesville history, we're really able to very much relate it to the larger national stories. This place holds so much, even when you're thinking about the moment of the Articles of Secession in 1861, mm-hmm. UVA raises the Confederate flag and declares itself a Confederate state. So, there's some real deep intention here that we can point to. And I think the work that is being done by the Now Center and others really helps us understand very well what that picture looks like as we're moving forward and thinking about the things that we've been talking about for the last few years.
Yeah, right. And speaking of moving forward, here's one of very illustrious, formerly enslaved persons, Isabella Gibbons, who had been enslaved at the university, and then after the war becomes a teacher at the Freedman School. So someone who's literate, was literate while she was enslaved too. Yeah. And is, and just that quick pivot just amazes me, Andrea.
Yeah. And, I think one of the things that we've not also talked about that I think accelerates in some ways is we've got 14,000 enslaved people, but there's not the largest free population in the South, but there are 600 free people living in Charlottesville and Albemarle County too. And that in some ways cannot be diminished in terms of the relationship between enslaved people and free people, because they're coming from the same families. Mm-hmm. They're moving in and out of these spaces. They're related. And so, someone like Isabella Gibbons, we're not quite sure exactly how she learns to read and write. We think she might have been taught by a professor at UVA. But what we know about her ability to read and write, and why she's my personal hero, I think she is the quintessential example of a revolutionary, is that as she is a teacher at the Freedman School, she's being paid by the Freedmen's Aid Society, and they all have to write reports. So we have a great account of her. But her daughter, Belle, mm-hmm. is also a teacher. And in mm-hmm. her papers, she says, "My mother taught me to read and write." Mm-hmm. And in order to do that, she was enslaved at the time, which means she was engaged in criminal activity.
That's right.
Right?
That's right. And
she's known to have been able to, she was reading the newspaper to enslave people, mm-hmm. and she was teaching people to read and write surreptitiously, right? Which also, I think if you start to talk about how that pivot occurs, it's people like Isabella that we can point to for those kinds of real histories. Berkeley Bullock learned to read and write as he was enslaved. There was runaways. He ran away at one point. So there's a lot of accounts also, as you began to say, of resistance to enslavement in one form or another. And for me, Isabella is the quintessential example of that.
Yeah, right. And the thing is, I mean, for resistance and kind of work to be sustained over time. Of course, now speaking as a social scientist, I mean, we got to talk about institutions, right? This doesn't just happen through the genius of individual, but they might be geniuses, individually, but it's the funneling, it's the coming together and the forming of organizations and institutions, such as Friedman schools and such, that is the precursor of the Jefferson School, of course, that gives structure to this kind of pushing forward.
Right. And you can also point to, the 800 people who left the white First Baptist Church and formed their own church. And then those people then, in the early days, because it was illegal for them to congregate, they had a white pastor. But the minute that they could form their church, they're sharing space with the Jefferson School.
That's right.
Over by the Delavan Hotel.
Yeah.
And so often when you talk about what does emancipation look like, you really also have to point to those moments of self-emancipation that are grounded in the institution, right? That the church is one of the places that they're learning to read and write. It's the place that they're finding themselves. And so you're completely right about that. And that's, again, part of the story here in Charlottesville.
Yeah. Right. And, and of course, part of that is the political mobilization, that starts occurring like immediately, after it's amazing how quickly Black voters in Charlottesville get mobilized, and of course, remember, Black people, now everyone's emancipated, Black people outnumber white people here. And Black people get mobilized very quickly, get registered to vote very quickly. Black voters outnumber white voters locally, much to the consternation, of the local newspapers and opinion leaders, and of course the Confederate veterans themselves that are, have come back and are living under federal occupation here. But Black people are rushing into that space, and they're getting mobilized.
Yep. And then that moment of universal suffrage, 75% of Black people in the South go and vote. And in Charlottesville, there is a contingency that is engaged in conversation with white leaders, and they basically lay it out. If you want our vote, here are the 9 things that we want to ensure, including free public education, including the ability to sit on juries, including the ability to not be thrown out of their homes. And then also there is a response on attempt to negotiate with that, right? Whites are saying, you want free public education? Does that mean you want Blacks and whites to go to school together? And they're like, no, we just want the ability to do that. So really early on, as you say, you see this understanding of what freedom means. Freedom is grounded in education, and freedom is grounded in the ability to vote. There's an article that appears in 1865 in September in the Charlottesville Chronicle that talks directly about this. The Negroes are free. Soon they'll want to sit on our juries and become magistrates. And at the end of it, it says something about, and soon they'll want to marry our daughters. So that at that moment, that particular statement really articulates clearly what it is that whites are concerned about and what Blacks are demanding for as descriptors of what freedom means for them.
Right. And to be sure, Blacks were not, that was the phantom that lived in the white imaginary about what Black newly freed folks wanted, was pretty far from what was sought, which was equality before the law. And so and being able to demand that in a formal setting. Here is the Constitutional Convention of 1867, and like all the other former Confederate states, Virginia has to redraw their state constitution to get up to snuff with federal standards. It's like, if you want readmission into the Union, you better come correct here, and be, this, includes, the, accepting the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, and and all these things. So this is quite a singular moment in Virginia state history, and again, Charlottesville is part of that. One of our delegates, one of our 2 delegates from Charlottesville was James T.S. Taylor, that U.S. colored troops veteran, who's there representing us. He was considered a quote unquote radical. Now, you did mention, Dr. Douglas, that that the fear was that among white people was that Black political leaders wanted there to be integrated public schools, and for the most part, yes, Black activists were not asking for that. James T.S. Taylor, who was considered a radical, at the time, did call for that. Actually, it was not something that he was successful in getting. But another thing that he wanted was he was considered a radical because he wanted former slaves to be able to sue their former masters for back wages. Isn't that great?
Yeah.
I mean, what would have happened if we would have had like reparations like in 1866? We'd be in a totally different situation, if that had happened then, being able to sue for, so that, and, also another thing that James T.S. Taylor wanted, our delegate from Charlottesville, was the ability to have a secret ballot in order to not be bullied upon going into the polling station, because that was a problem that had happened. Actually, here in Charlottesville before the war, there was one Republican in town who wanted to vote for Lincoln, and he went to try to vote at what is now the Levy Opera House, which is now the courthouse there on the corner of Park and High Street, right? Tried to go vote, and he was harassed and kicked out. He couldn't vote. And so, it's because he was an abolitionist. He wanted to vote for Lincoln. Anyway, so the joke was on them though, because then after the war, under federal occupation, they made that guy the mayor. So this is
and the interesting thing, you're when you were talking about radicalism and you're talking about people, this is the moment also when you begin to see the uptick of racial violence, the original, the creation of the original Klan, the idea that of trying to bring people back into enslavement in one way or another. So the ability to read, the ability to write, the ability to vote and express one's notions of freedom, this becomes really, really important because it is also a very dangerous place.
That's right.
Right. What you're looking at is the breaking down of the economic system of the South. That is, this is the beginning of the moment of peonage and chain gangs, where people, the loitering laws, those Black code laws that are being established, that are impacting people's ability to travel on the road as they are moving around trying to find their own people and find, walking off of plantations is not a easy thing to do in this moment. It is dangerous. And it's at that point, those vagrancy laws are really, really attempting to pull people back into the system of enslavement. And so dangerous times. And we should view those times, what's happening, what these people are, James T.S. Taylor, Isabella Gibbons, and others are doing at this particular moment as real sort of radical thinking in that way.
Absolutely. I mean, and just the risk factor here and just how ambiguous things are. I mean, it's like, we kind of point to these singular moments like the Emancipation Proclamation, January the 1st, 1863. Well, yes and no, right? I mean, it's like, well, it's only states that are still fighting against the Union. So Maryland, you can keep your slaves, right? And it's not enforced everywhere, arrive, Union troops to Charlottesville, Sheridan's not exactly getting up there, championing, Black rights, as this is going on. It's really, when we talk about emancipation, it's not a one and done thing. It is not. It is a struggle. It's 2 steps forward, 1 back. It's just,
Right.
Yeah.
And written in it, we can't forget the exclusion clause, right? Which is that crime clause. That's the thing. This notion of criminality. You can be returned to enslavement if you are deemed a criminal.
Right.
And so, what makes criminality at this point is also
right.
right.
Yeah. And who's a felon? Somebody who steals a chicken or something. I mean, it's
Right.
It's very much targeted at
Right.
Yeah.
And when you go back to those WPA things, Peter Fawcett is one of the people who's interviewed, and Peter Fawcett says they turned us out like dogs.
Yeah.
Some of us had mothers and fathers, and those of us who didn't, we had to fend for ourselves. And so that's the kind of condition that we're talking about as we're describing the sort of radical movement towards engagement in politics and in the institutions that you talk about.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so by the time, you get, federal Reconstruction officially ends in 1877. That means like federal troops withdraw from southern states. So we had a 12-year experiment in multiracial democracy there. We're still trying to get back to it, and it ends there in 1877. And then there's still kind of remnants of it, vestiges of it that kind of hang on for a little bit more, like in North Carolina, here in Virginia until the 1880s. You have this horrible incident in Danville in 1883, right before the election, where there's, basically, there's a riot, kind of a massacre. I mean, there was a multiracial city government, had both Black and white aldermen or councilmen. And a bunch of white supremacists attacked them. There were deaths, and then were killings. And this was right before the election. And basically, Black people couldn't go to the polls for fear of their lives. This is in Danville. And that's 15 or 16 years before the Wilmington massacre. It was horrible. A similar thing where you have a interracial city council or Black members of the city, and being killed, and Black people being prevented from voting. So this is what's going on. Yeah, 1880s. This is starting. That's 1883. That's happening in Danville, and then there's this chipping away as actually General Lee's nephew gets elected governor. Another former Confederate official. So there, it's like the Confederates are back in play in the mid 1880s. Here you see this wonderful picture. This is from the late 80s. It's been whittled down. These are the only, there's, 8 members of the General Assembly.
That began with 29.
Yes. Yeah. Right. And this is what we've been whittled down to, by the late 1880s. And then, by the time, 1889, the Richmond Times-Dispatch is just crowing that this is the first unmixed General Assembly we have, meaning there are no Black people in it, and the first thing they do is 1890. The first thing that new quote unquote unmixed General Assembly does is vote for appropriations for the huge Lee statue that was installed in 1890. So it's definitely a we're back, kind of message that's being sent, and that, so there's a direct connection between the politics of white supremacy and the symbolism that's being raised in public spaces.
Yeah. Hey, Jalane, before we go further, there's a question that about Nat Turner's revolt that we might want to address. Interestingly, the question says if we've all heard of Nat Turner's revolt, but I'm curious if in the course of your research you learned of any slave rebellions, attempted rebellions in Charlottesville. In fact, I don't know any rebellions, but I do know that Charlottesville's white population attempted to create to muster together a group that would police against any insurrections. And that was written up in the Daily Progress, right? They were very concerned about Nat Turner. They were very concerned here about the idea of rebellion. And in 1830, if you understand, that's the sort of the beginnings of the abolitionist movement, generally speaking. And so Charlottesville, in the newspapers, you see that they are concerned about the movement and the violence of African-American people. And so they attempt to create their own little guard to safeguard the town. I've not found anything yet about an actual slave rebellion here, but we do know that there was responses to the idea of rebellion here.
Well, and we know that James Madison's grandfather was poisoned to death by his slaves out there on the Madison estate out there in Montpelier. That was not during this year. I mean, so there were acts of resistance going on in different places, but in terms of kind of an organized revolt on the scale of, say, Prosser's conspiracy in Richmond, or the Nat Turner revolt, or that no, not around here. And you mentioned the slave patrols that are founded, and there's some great historical studies that have been done on that, and there were definitely slave patrols here in Charlottesville and Albemarle County. And one of the first instances, and I noticed that it was Dave Norris that asked this question, so he'll appreciate this very much. The city really wanted to annex more territory in the county. Sound familiar? This is kind of scraping an old wound. It's back in the the 18 teens or 20s or something. And the reason they wanted to do that is that they wanted their slave patrols to be able to go out further into the county to the tippling houses, that is the bars, where enslaved people and sometimes free blacks would hang out together. They were worried that there was too much fraternizing going on, and they would be planning a revolt. So some of the very first instances of, and the county didn't want to give that land to the city. So some of the very first instances of city and county tension about land annexation, and it has to do with slavery and slave patrols and policing black bodies. Isn't that something? Yeah. And then, I should say, with the John Brown attack on Harper's Ferry in 1859, this town was just in a tizzy. And that's when you get the formation of, I guess the Monticello Guards, I think, formed before then, but which becomes one of the, in the regiment of the 19th Virginia. But so you have the formation of two militia groups, in response to, one just slightly before John Brown's revolt, and then one immediately after as a direct response to that, in order to maintain order, there. So there's definitely a lot of paranoia here,
Yep. And we can even point to, up until that point in the free black population, there was a sort of relaxing of the need for free blacks in the community to register. And that changes in around 1859. And so you see this free black population go from something like 600 to 500 because they are moving out as a consequence of having to that they're being more directly policed.
Right.
That number goes up again with the relaxation, but it is in response to, again, this idea that there is some insurrection going on in other places, and now we have to pay more attention to the populations that are here. And that free black population is as much more mobile, certainly, than the slave population.
Right. Which is why James T.S. Taylor said, "I am out of here. I'm tired." It was just getting you had to have a pass to leave your house. I mean, even if you're a free black person, you couldn't be out on the streets after 9 p.m. And just the strictures just are just, and it's because of that paranoia, because of the potential for revolt. Absolutely. Yeah. Is there another question there for that?
No, I think that one's one we needed to address before we move to.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to just kind of show. Let's see if I can mind my window here. If I can go back to this here. About just, talking about the importance of institutions in order to kind of to channel this sort of resistance, or the, emancipation has to take some sort of form, and so, schools are, as we've talked about, really important here. We have, as I said, until the 1880s, there's a progressive party called the readjusters. They want to readjust the war debt, in order to allow for things like public works, construction, roads, bridges, schools, etc. And the conservatives, of course, did not want this. And interestingly, and here's where there is hope for interracial political coalitions. It's not a foregone conclusion that this cannot be. I think sometimes we forget, that again, there's this hopeful moment there, after, during Reconstruction, where you have in a couple of cases here in Virginia, a couple of former Confederates, and I think of Mosley, John Singleton Mosley, of all people, and William Mahone, who said, yeah, I was wrong, and I'm reconstructed, and I want to go forward with Black political allies and form something new. So there is this possibility, and it was quite the formidable force in Virginia politics. There didn't always win the day, but was definitely part of pushing the discussion in a more progressive direction. Yeah. So then, just to talk about another institution that's really important here is the 400 Club.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And John West is an interesting character, right? He is Isabella Gibbons' biological son, but again, talking about that relationship between the free Black and the enslaved population. He is adopted by Nancy and Jane West. Mm-hmm. And when Nancy West dies, she gives this 21-year-old man, he inherits her wealth. Mm-hmm. And you're pointing to Black property ownership in Charlottesville in the 1880s, but John West buys his first property in 1870, and it is in Vinegar Hill. He is responsible for actually creating that first property. So if you walk out Commerce Street from the front door of the Jefferson School, and I say front door because Commerce mm-hmm. Street for me is the front door.
That's right.
And you cross the street, that's that property that John West buys, right?
Mm-hmm. Where the Quirk Hotel is now? No. Where the empty parking lot, where the hotel that is what is it called? The hotel that's on the corner of Ridge and Main Street. Gotcha. Right.
That mm-hmm. their parking lot, right?
Okay.
That property is right now just an empty blacktop space. But corner of Commerce Street and 4th Street, if you walk right into there directly, Commerce Street used to go through. It was a through street. So right mm-hmm. on the corner of Commerce and 4th was John West's first property that he buys in 1870. Right. He sells that property to 1888 to none other than Nanny Cox Jackson, right? Mm-hmm. So when you're talking about Black property ownership and the 400 Club, he's a very important figure in establishing that, which ultimately, by the time Vinegar Hill is removed, it is one of the oldest at that point neighborhoods, communities in Charlottesville. Forget about it being a Black community, but its origins are that early. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
And it catches national notice, of different Black advocacy organizations that, wow, Charlottesville's Black folks are really organized. They've got this thing, this 400 Club. They're buying property. They're doing stuff. And, building institutions, that it's within organizations that we can, kind of give form to, what emancipation can look like. And here, First Baptist Church, of course, as we've already mentioned, very important form. Just in the very last year of the war, I think 1864 was when they finally kind of cleaved off, I believe, from the white First Baptist Church. But important organization. And then, of course, Jefferson School, where we are holding this talk. It's been for decades. There's been hosting, a community forum, for talking about issues, in our city and racial justice. And that this is, part of the fomenting of, of the growth of institutions that came out of the Reconstruction era. We can like trace back to, the Reconstruction era, the seeds of the Jefferson School and what became the Jefferson School there.
Yeah, and just going back to this idea of the 400 Club, you can't forget the Piedmont Industrial Land Improvement Company that forms in the 1890s. And again, in the newspapers, it says something like, our people are moving. This is from the Richmond Planet, who had a reporter here. And so the reporter is a Charlottesville reporter that's reporting out, thousands of people read the Richmond Planet. And so, these people are not just thinking, yes, we want to form, we want to build churches. They built 4 churches before, by the first decade of the turn of the century. You've got First Baptist, you've got Mount Zion First African Baptist, you've got Ebenezer Church that is built. And then by 1907, you've completed Zion Union Church, all within stone throws of each other. Yeah. There's property being purchased along Dice Street. There's property being purchased in Vinegar Hill, and businesses are being created. In 1875, when Felina Karkin, who's the second white teacher who comes from Massachusetts, she's leaving Charlottesville, and she says, when I first got here, and she got here in 1867, I used to have to read and write for the African-American population. Now, as I'm leaving, I'm looking out my window and I see buildings that are popping up along Main Street, that it's in homes. And so she's describing for us, this movement from post-emancipation into these 1870s, 1880s period. And it's all about the development of this Black community.
That's right. That's right. Great. Well, I wanted to see if there's any audience questions or something before we talk about what the Jefferson School is doing these days. They're doing a lot of things these days, but it just in terms of the Jefferson School serving as a forum for the Black community and for the Charlottesville community at large, as well, going on here, which is this, it's incredible to think, of the deep roots of the Jefferson School in this community, kind of stretching all the way back, and kind of in its lineage, to those freedmen schools, to think of, the sort of leadership that the Jefferson School has provided to the community throughout the years. And now again, we're at this critical juncture in our community with talking about public space, and Black people have, done so much, as we've talked about, here about constructing spaces here in Charlottesville. And now to have, the Jefferson School kind of serving as the host, to kind of convene the community to discuss these issues.
Yeah. I think that, everyone I think that is associated with this school or this project, from the various boards that put together the project to save the city center, and the various people in the community, whether it be an alumni, whether it be people who have just general interest in the place because their children went to school here at one point. Working here, we are trying to continue the tradition that we have just defined and described. And so that is really, I believe, what has brought us to this place. As the in the 1920s, as Jim Crow laws in Virginia really started to take hold as a consequence of the Racial Integrity Act, as it became illegal for Blacks and whites to congregate in public space together, it was the Jefferson School where the Black community turned in on itself in some ways, and it created a space where it could have its social space as much as its educational space. And I think it continued through. And so we're just building on what we inherited in doing this particular work.
Absolutely.
And, our intent, your intent, my intent, those who have been working with us on this particular project, is really to sort of cause us to not just live in history, quote unquote, but also to make history.
Mm-hmm.
Find a way of continuing to define Charlottesville public space and social space as the histories that we have described to this point has done that. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I'm looking forward to seeing our friends that we hadn't been seeing before and really talking about what it means to live here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I wonder if we could, it's incredible to think about, just the history that the Jefferson School has traversed, in a century or so, and to think about, this, to be able to provide this kind of leadership in the community is really, it's really crucial at this time, I think, for us.
There is a question about the history of the Gospel Hill properties. We've not yet done a deep dive into Gospel Hill, but we do have some information through the Mapping Seville project. We are beginning to articulate that. We know that Gospel Hill was another fairly early near turn of the century community. That Lee Street was one of the boundaries of Gospel Hill. And I think some of those properties were lost through eminent domain, and some of them had covenants on them that made them unretrievable thereafter. And so we're only just beginning to really do the oral history work and the identification of those properties. But the stories are out there. It's just one of those other places that had not been attended to in the time that we have been working.
Right. And it's, again, one of these, kind of untold histories. I mean, this is where the UVA hospital system is now, bordered by 9th, 10th Connector or Roosevelt Brown Boulevard, because that is like where he lived. Yeah. Was in that neighborhood, I assume, so yeah, this is, more landscape,
Yeah, he actually grew up off of 5th Street.
Oh, was it? Oh, okay.
Behind where the Jefferson School is, Yeah, there's a question. What was the shift in Charlottesville local government, including then excluding freed Blacks?
Well, in terms of city, like elected leadership, I mean, that wasn't happening, in terms of like Black elected officials, not until, mid to, late, 20th century, but, in terms of, there was, there was a community of freed Blacks here, and particularly, those who had been veterans of the War for Independence, who had free status, here. Yeah, and then and then there's kind of this tightening that happens that we talked about, kind of in the years leading up to the war, especially after the the fugitive slave law goes into effect, and there's just a lot more kind of sectional tensions and and this sort of thing, that freed Blacks are kind of feeling their movement being constricted more and more, and then to the point of even conscription as we talked about. But yeah, this is not until much after the Voting Rights Act, basically, that you have that kind of inclusion in terms of elected office.
Yeah, there is one of the Coles brothers, I believe it's Charles Coles, runs for city council in the 1940s, and he does not win. And it's around the 1940s that you start to see what happens in the 1920s is the Charlottesville delegation of African American people, Charlottesville's Black population were Republicans, and they were deeply engaged. So George Inge, we know about Inge's story. George Inge was one of the leaders in the African American Republican Party. And in the 1920s, they don't seat the Black delegation in the Luray Convention. And at that point, that bipartisan relationship that we had talked about ends.
Yeah.
The white Republicans say literally they want their lily white party back.
Right.
And then they essentially jettison these delegates from participation. They're not allowed to sit. One would argue at that point that you begin to see the decline of Black political engagement. But post-war, you then begin to see an upscale. So after the Depression era, by right about 1940, 1942, you start to see a resurgence of political interest, to the point that someone then attempts to run for city council and then doesn't win. By 1949, you've got the formation of the new NAACP. And by 1953, you again start to see this. But I want to say, when you're thinking about the Reconstruction period, that first generation gives rise to a second generation. And that second generation is a generation that, by the time we get to 1970, that second and third generation, that is where you begin to see that political resurgence, because they're responding to a movement towards civil rights. The NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, it started in 1933, and they start to challenge these separate but equal spaces. And so that's what you begin to see in the later histories.
Yeah. So Reconstruction period, a lot of involvement, a lot in elected office, and then, the kind of reconsolidation during Jim Crow, the end of Reconstruction kind of ebbing away. And then, like you said, the Luray Convention, the Republican Convention in 1922, refusing to seat the delegates from Charlottesville who are Black. That's amazing, And then, kind of coming up after the war again. Right.
Well, I think we have come to the end of our time. Thank you so very much for spending this time with us. I love talking about this history. And so Jalane and I may seem a little eggheady about it, but when you really want to, the reason why I do this work is because I just think this is just a tremendous story.
Yeah.
People talk about resilience, and I never use that word. I like persistence as a word much better, because I believe that at that moment of emancipation, the true sense of what freedom means, Black people here are not waiting till 1930 or 1940. They come right out of the blocks, 1865, 67. Someone asked me, when did I think the civil rights movement started in Charlottesville? And I was like, 1866. And so that's why I enjoy this story the way that I do and love talking about it. And hope that you enjoyed what you heard tonight.
Great. Yeah.
Do you want to say give the last word there?
Oh, I there's never a last word, but we just want to thank our audience and folks that we've worked with, on so many projects, and encourage people to come out Saturday. The in-person is full. Come out on 3 p.m. Saturday to talk about public space. What are we going to do now that we've got a blank slate, folks? What are we going to do? Let's talk about this. So info@jeffschoolheritagecenter.org. Yeah.
Yep.
That's the
email address.
Yeah, to get the Zoom link. Because we're at capacity because of COVID. We have only unlimited number of people can come in person, and we're at capacity there in person. But please participate on Zoom. This will be a facilitated conversation to talk about the future of public space in Charlottesville. We invite you to come for that. We deliberately timed it to come during Liberation and Freedom Days, and we want to hear from you.
All right. Thanks very much. Have a
Thank
good night.
you. Thanks, folks.